Hi, you're listening in to an extra episode of Gay and Grey Montreal's series Queer Elders Sharing. In that series, we talk to Diane Labelle. In this extra episode, Diane talks about the inextricable and intergenerational link between Canada's residential school system and two-spirit or queer Indigenous identity today. If you or someone you know needs support or wants to talk to someone for help, the number for the National Indian Residential School Crisis Line is 1-866-925-4419. That's 1-866-925-4419. Now, let's listen in to Diane. My next set of questions will be to you as a person, but also to you as an educator. And I also just wanted to give a warning to listeners or any kind of viewers that we're going to be speaking about a little bit about the residential school system. So I wanted to give a hotline number for people who might be hearing something and need some help, or just anyone in crisis and needs any kind of services. The National Indian Residential School Crisis Line, if you need to reach out for any kind of help, is at 1-866-925-4419. Again, that's 1-866-925-4419. And they can also point you to some other services as well. So I wanted to speak about, as we discuss on this podcast and in general in Quebec today, we can talk about some instances of homophobia or transphobia that people might have experienced throughout their lifetimes. And it's in a heteronormative world. And the heteronormative world is also a colonized one. What would you want people to know about the experiences of being Indigenous and queer, if we're going to use that word, from your perspective? Just talk a little bit about accepting within their own community, within themselves, and through the greater community.
The colonial plan required that we undo many of the belief systems within Indigenous communities. Anything that proved to be a strength or a binding of these nations was to be undone. And from their arrival here, towards the mid-1800s, the colonists saw the advantage of being able to own the lands that Indigenous people lived on. To them, they saw these lands as being underused. They wanted to use these lands to engage in massive agriculture. So it wasn't okay that they maintained a sustainable agricultural system within their communities, because, you see, they weren't mass producing food. One of the essential values is that you only use what you need. There is no need to do more. You don't have to have all that surplus. But for the non-Indigenous, the Western view, all of that surplus could be used for profit. So for them, these lands were being underused. And in order to have access to them, they had to rid themselves of those who were inhabiting these lands. And so they engaged in a series of legislation that would whittle away at the base of the culture and break them down. And if they could break them down and assimilate Indigenous nations, they could engage them in the same colonial project, right? So that was the basis or the thought behind all of this. And it's important to really understand that it's a colonial project. It was thought out. It wasn't just haphazard. This was a plan. And the plan began with banning languages and banning ceremonies and trying to legally assimilate people by enforcing them to what we call enfranchisement, right? You're seen as a person of good moral character, and you speak more than one language, or you speak the colonial language, therefore you don't have to be Indigenous anymore. You are now a Canadian citizen. And this was, again, imposed. It wasn't a choice. And so by that, they would remove people from these lands that they wanted them to occupy. They displaced many people. They created the reservation system to move people away from the basis of the land, which is where the roots are, the anchor, right, for Indigenous people. And by banning all of those things, it had a certain amount of success on the part of the colonists, but not enough, and it still wasn't sufficient. We have to change the mindset. We have to change the way they think so that they believe what we want them to believe, or what we believe. I mean, I'm saying that they honestly believe these things were right for them, but they had the practice of imposing those thoughts and world's views on everybody else. And so they legislated the Indian Act, and in that, on Section 2, the original Indian Act, it said a person is any other than an Indian, anybody else but an Indian. And with that statement, clearly explained how they saw Indigenous people. They were not humans. They were not people. And this is the image that was perpetuated generation after generation through the non-Indigenous education system, always not seeing Indigenous people as human, right? And it also gave them permission to do many things that they wanted to because they're not human. So it's not surprising that they would then send them all to residential schools far away from their communities. And the purpose behind that is that if they were prevented from going home, if the children did not have the influence of their families, which had the language, the culture, the traditions, then they have a better chance of teaching them the right language, the right sense of belief, the right, and making them the way for them to engage, I guess, in the Canadian society. And so 139 residential schools were set up across Canada, 11 of which were here in Quebec. And these were run by religious orders that believed very strongly in the binary gender system and specific social roles for men and women. And anything outside of that was deemed wrong, and more than that, deemed a sin. And it's very dangerous when you combine that notion of sin, right, and behavior. It's not just your behavior that's wrong, because, hey, if your behavior is wrong, you can always change your behavior. But if you are the cause, you are the sin, you are the aberration, it's your whole being that doesn't belong, that is wrong. And that is more impactful. It's not something you can change. For individuals who went to residential school, we know this week we're going to be talking a great deal about residential school. We talk about the atrocities and the abuses that took place, the children that never came home, the bodies that were left, the system that was put into place to force people to believe something different. And one of those is that it is wrong to be attracted to the same gender. It's wrong to be different and not follow those roles. You're not the housewife, right? Or that you're not the dominant male who directs everything in the family. You've heard of the expression, the rule of thumb?
Yeah.
Right. And a lot of people don't understand what that means, right? And that it's based in a law, a British law, that said that a man had the right to beat his wife and child with a stick, so long as the stick was not any wider than the width of his thumb. So these were the ideas that were impressed upon Indigenous children from the age Initially, it was from the age of 5 to 17. And then we see now that they would take children as young as 3 and bring them into the system. And these are your formative years. This is where you develop your ideas and thoughts and learn your values and your beliefs and your language and everything. And they then had this opportunity to mold these individuals, believing in new values. These are the values that come back to the community for 5 to 7 generations. In addition to that, we add the harm done in terms of sexual abuse. So, that are deemed same sex, right? And again, we add another dimension to it of how painful, physically painful it is, and how hurtful it is. So it's got to be a sin. And so we saw the rise of homophobia and transphobia in Indigenous communities. So as these generations return with these ideas, they begin to shun their own. Those who were differently gendered or had different sexual orientations, when they went to residential school, they have they have stories to tell. Yet they were excluded a lot from the experiences of people as we started to record these stories of those who went to residential school, because they faced something totally different. So if you are born and you are let to be who you are and respected for who you are in a traditional context, when you arrive residential school and they say, okay, boys, girls, everything is divided into gender, and you don't know where to go, right? And so some will tell the story of, maybe being in a female body but end up on the male side, and it's only when they're in the showers that they realize it, and then they get beaten for trying to do something wrong, or they did something wrong without understanding, well, what is this? And then end up being put with the girls and not being fully accepted there as well, right? By the individuals who run the residential schools. And so it becomes very confounding for them, very difficult. So they've experienced all of these abuses and were put down for who they are. Sinful. They are wrong. And so when they return to the communities, they have to abide by whatever roles are being observed, either male or female, right? And so you hide yourself. I did a presentation in one community last week, and at the end, one of the things that this one nurse said was, what I'm retaining from this is, I'm thinking about those individuals, those older individuals who ended up living and dying alone. And now I'm wondering, were they two-spirited? Did they isolate themselves because they didn't fit anywhere? And it's a really sad thing, because that's a reality. Many of the individuals no longer were able to be themselves in the community, and this is something that still happens, unfortunately. It's not safe to be even within your own family because of the interference of these thoughts and beliefs now. That it's hard to live, the homophobia, transphobia, and so they leave the communities to try and find a safer place, and coming into urban areas only to face horrible racism and being put in another bind, right? So not being able to find solace there either. And I remember my partner saying, she had to at one point decide whether or not she was going to live within the Indigenous community or outside the community, because you have more freedom to be yourself, gender and sexual orientation-wise, on the outside, but then would have to hide on the inside. But what you're doing is that you're giving up your culture, you're giving up your place, you're giving up your home, right? And so it's always at a cost. So a part of you has to shut down. Either you live in a community and shut down that true nature that you have, or you live outside the community and shut down your Indigenous identity. So it's very difficult for in young people and even older people to live openly in their communities. In fact, even the communities that say that they are open. And the question I would have to ask, and somebody asked me this when I said that, what would happen if two same-sex, same-gendered people walked hand in hand down the street in your community? And I don't think there's one community that would be okay with that, at least not from my experience. We say we're open, but there's a lot of healing that has to happen to understand where those thoughts and those beliefs came from and why they're there and why they're so strong at this point. It's more open in some communities, for sure, but until we normalize and bring it back, until we heal all of the wounds from residential school and the Indian Act and the Canadian colonist plan, it's going to be very, very different. Very, very, very difficult to be able to live openly in your community. Rates of suicide for individuals who are two-spirit, to use the word to make it a little easier, are 4 times higher than the high rates of suicide for Indigenous youth as they are. So we know that just by being Indigenous, you have a higher rate of suicide. Then add to that the difficulty of living within your own community, because again, it's like you don't belong, right? There's no place for you. There's no role. And if you don't have a purpose for life, right? And then you get to that non-person status, right? There's no reason for you to be here. And it's very, very sad. And it happens in the community where I'm living now, but it happens elsewhere. You hear of all these suicides or people who say, you're right, I don't have a place. I don't have a place and I have no purpose. And if I have no purpose, why should I be here? So what was stripped is not not just their ability to live comfortably within their own families and communities, but their purpose. And that's what colonization has done. And that's an aspect when we talk about residential school that we need to look at. That is a very important aspect that is often neglected when we talk about residential school. The fact that they stripped those individuals of any purpose.
And made it about existence rather than behavior.
Yep. And then how do you navigate that world of religious belief, spiritual belief, right? And being who you are. It's the constant conflict. Then there's the whole idea of coming out in an Indigenous community, right? 1, that's difficult, and 2, it's not really something that is Indigenous per se. You don't stand above or outside of the circle. You're all on the same level. So coming out has this idea of putting focus or emphasis on you. It's an individualistic thing. And so I'm very, very happy that we're now talking about the idea of coming in. We come into our identity. We come into the circle. We come into our family and assume or resume our roles within the community. Hey, Ganawake has a two-spirited Grand Chief. Wow. And I'm so happy that it wasn't, I know the media tried to make it a big thing, and the way that she approached it was wonderful, to just say, it's a non-issue. It's a non-issue. And that's the way it should be. Who I sleep with, none of your business. Mm-hmm. Right? That doesn't define me. What defines me in this role is my ability to lead my community, to listen to the members of my community, to be able to affect change for everybody. So approaching it from that perspective, you are part of, you are in rather than out.